Good morning, afternoon, and good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Kelly Barner, and I'm the General Manager at Art of Procurement. I'd like to thank everybody for being here for today's very interesting AOP Live session focused on the supplier experience. If this is your first AOP Live, a couple things about format. You're not missing the slides. There are no slides. This is completely a live video conversation with our guests, but you have an important role to play all the same. Many of you submitted questions going through the registration process, but you'll also have the opportunity to continue engaging with our guests and submitting comments and questions as we go through today's session. So if you take a look at your user panel, you'll see there's a questions session. Phil Eidson, who is the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement, is going to be monitoring that. Make sure you keep him busy. We want to keep him fielding lots of questions and comments over the hour. So we're actually going to let him pop off a video so that he can focus and type without trying to smile and look into the camera at the same time. And then we will go ahead and get started with today's session. So the foundational information that's behind what we're going to be discussing today is actually based on a research survey and resulting report that was run by HICS. The report is called Putting the Supplier Experience at the Forefront of Strategic Procurement. And there's a URL that Phil's going to be popping into the chat box. If you're interested in downloading that report, I highly encourage you to do so. There are a lot of very interesting and actionable findings in there. And so please do take a minute to go and download that. And because there is so much to discuss in that report, this is not a one-part AOP Live, but a full three-part series. So it's 3 consecutive Thursdays. And in the next 2 weeks, which are on July 29th and August 5th, we'll be looking into first supplier experience management in practice, and then next understanding the ROI of world-class supplier experience. For those 2 events, we'll be joined by Adam Brown, who is the head of the digital garage at BT Procurement, and he'll be joined by Kostas Salianis from HICS, that's on the 29th. And then on August 5th, we'll be joined by Rob Bonner, who is the Global Procurement Director at SHV Energy, as well as Mary Beth Lang, who is the Chief Supply Chain and Procurement Officer at Kaiser Permanente. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to my 2 guests that are with us here today. We have Charlotte de Brabandt, who is a representative of the Institute for Supply Management, as well as Ramit Mahajan, who is the head of Supply Chain Enablement EMEA at Henkel. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Kelly, for having us.
Thank you very much.
So, Ramit, let's start with you. This is sort of the classic AOP get to know you question. Did you find procurement supply chain or did it find you?
So in my case, Kelly, it definitely found me. I actually began my career as a sales and marketing guy. I was not a supply chain procurement person to begin with. So my initial 5-6 years were actually in sales and marketing. And then in GE, so I was working with GE at that time, and in GE we used to have this program called Six Sigma. So that's when I got into Six Sigma, that's when I actually got into the whole process, and then the supply chain and procurement happened. So it was, in my case, definitely it found me.
It found you. And how about you, Charlotte? Did you find procurement or did it find you?
I think in my case, I chose procurement. It already started with the age of 6 when I was a little girl going to the market with my grandmother and already negotiating all of the fruits and vegetables. And from that point onwards, I just loved that whole interaction with other people. And it continued throughout my university studies when I also specialized in innovation, very much won a lot of entrepreneurship competitions. And then shortly after that, started at in this procurement program from Volkswagen, moved to Porsche, direct, indirect procurement, and then my latest role at Johnson & Johnson.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for sharing that. There's actually one other piece of context that I would like everybody to have. We've all been through quite a year and a half, and different countries, different companies, different industries are all at different points in either the recovery journey, or maybe starting to settle into a little bit more of a new normal. Without going into too many of the specifics, do you mind just sharing briefly, Charlotte, and then I'll come to you, Ramit, what would you say is the current tone in your company in terms of, are you in recovery mode? Are you still trying to anticipate what's coming? How stabilized are things currently within your company and procurement team?
Well, I think first many think that they are in recovery mode, but I believe we are actually still going through the challenge, just because we are, as we are seeing in the news, after having had that first hurdle of challenges getting the supply. Right now, we have challenges of cybercrime, data breaches, cyber attacks all around us, really, and now more than ever before. So I think the impact and threat level has truly risen and just become the #1 risk factor right now within organization and also within our supply chain. So so I think that whole overall cost of cybercrime, it has been underestimated, and I think we are just right now in this whole bubble.
Okay, absolutely. No, challenges continue to abound. Ramit, how about you? Where would you say that Henkel is on that journey back towards stability or some type of next normal?
So in the case of Henkel now, we are in 3 businesses. We are in adhesives, we are in beauty care, so we have shampoos, and we have laundry products. So in the case of Henkel, a lot of our segments actually grew. So especially laundry care and some parts of beauty care, they actually grew. The hygiene products, they actually grew. But overall, I think we had a fairly stable year. So I would not call us in a recovery mode. I think in Henkel, we pretty early realized that this is going to be a new normal. And that's what we are now trying to adjust towards. We do not expect to go to a pre-pandemic reality. So we have been globally trying to move very quickly towards this new normal, and that's to me, that's the mode that we are in right now. Of course, there are a whole set of new challenges that we are encountering, and we are, of course, tackling them as we go.
Excellent. And actually, it's interesting because between companies and industries, there have been some incredible unexpected opportunities to grow. And so maybe let me stay with you and ask, what would you say some of the key changes are that you have seen between your company, your team, and your suppliers over the course of the last year and a half, maybe due to some of either the growth that you experienced or the conditions that you were trying to work through?
So the beginning of the pandemic, I think we were all in the same storm, as they say. So I think what really happened, it came too fast, and globally everything was shut down, and then everything started to open up. And I think we formed these crisis management teams across countries, and so that was something that we continue even now. But then what we realized was that the recovery that came was quite uneven, unequal. So suppliers in certain countries were, let's say, struggling more than the others. So we had to kind of make sure that we're catching hold, we're holding their hands, we're bringing them together with us. So one thing that for sure happened was that we had far more stress on transparency of information, because we knew that there's far more uncertainty of between whether we're going to get the product, when we're going to get the products, and so on. So the stress was really, and this was of course across the entire supply chain. So our customers demanded this of us, and then therefore we demanded this of the suppliers. So the transparency had to really go up. The second thing that I think changed quite a bit was the resilience. So early on, we realized that depending on a single supplier, single country was not going to help. So we really ramped up our redundancy in the supply chain. So we had definitely more suppliers. The procurement teams really went aggressively looking for more suppliers wherever possible, of course. I think that definitely helps. So the other example, again towards the resilience would be in the warehouse network. So suddenly there was so much material that was coming to the ports, and the customers were not open. So we had to suddenly get so much space. So on the logistics side, we really ramped up very quickly as well. So all of these changes, I think, it was the whole thing was about speed at that time, because things were changing so quickly. Things were from the one week to the next, the whole scenario used to change. And of course, there were the government interfaces. So across, the governments were trying to make sense of what's happening. They were coming out with new rules and regulations so quickly. So as organizations, we were trying to keep up with those rules and regulations, making sure that our drivers, our suppliers, all of us are adhering to those new rules. So it was as big a change as probably I have seen in my career, and I'm sure many of us. So yeah, that's what it was.
Absolutely. And Charlotte, I could see you nodding when Ramit was talking about transparency. Was there anything around transparency in the context of relationships with suppliers that you wanted to add to from your experience?
Yes, so I definitely agree with every single point that Ramit made, so I will not be repeating it. But just to add, because I can truly confirm, and that experience I've also made, but just to add, also in terms of all of the logistical problems and securing supply, other problems that occurred were suddenly fraud and corruption, and they were suppliers, they were sending you certain products or such as masks, but suddenly they were not real, and they did not, and they were counterfeits, or they did not have the filter, or just a lot of challenges where suddenly a lot of procedures, regulations internally had to increase. So I think 3 points I would like to add overall is more, there've been a lot more internal and external security procedures, a lot more alerts in terms of also quality, is it counterfeit, but also the payments. So many times we were faced with situations where a supplier wanted to have the payment upfront before delivery, and then it does ring a few bells. Why do you want 100% of the payment, and is it really real, or is it just some company that no one can follow at the end? So that has definitely been seen, and so a lot of security procedures. Secondly, I would say just establishing these security guidelines, more controls, quality controls, internally, externally, making sure that the employees are aware of what's going on, and then going into that dialogue with the supplier. Do we have a record with that supplier, or is it a new one? What else has to be done? And then thirdly, I would say just a lot of training, sharing best practices with our staff, with suppliers, lessons learned, just to really make sure everyone is aware that, hey, there are counterfeits, there is fraud, there is currently corruption, there are these political barriers, port closures, they just making sure everyone is really alert. So I think what has happened, a lot more communication training, but in terms of communication, internal communication, and then also supplier directed communication, working together and truly building that trust with the relations that we have already established.
Absolutely. And to that point about established relationships, one of the things that procurement has talked about for a long time that I wonder if we've changed our thoughts on is this notion about wanting to be a customer of choice with certain key or strategic suppliers, depending on the terminology that your organization uses. Charlotte, would you say that, previously being a customer of choice probably was around, access to information or opportunities to innovate or collaborate, but over the last year and a half, being a customer of choice meant having your order filled completely or having your order filled on time? Did you notice any changes to what it actually meant to see when your organization was a customer of choice and the types of relationships that existed with the suppliers that seemed to work with you in that way?
Well, Absolutely, there has been a change. I think in the past, you were that customer of choice if you, for example, had a big spend for your supplier, or you had that good collaboration or that innovation, as you just mentioned.
Yeah.
But I think being that strategic customer of choice now and in the future, it really relied on a lot of open communication, strong listening, establishing that trust with each other. I think in terms of being that customer of choice now, it depends, of course, on the situation, whether
Yes.
it's a small supplier, big supplier, how important are we to the supplier? But ultimately, that dialogue, if the supplier, for example, needed to have immediate payment terms, not just blocking it off, but actually bringing that topic internally to your leadership, discussing it. When do we give immediate payment terms? When can we support the supplier? Where can we adjust? So I think it's a very much individualized case, but now being that customer of choice, you cannot just, like in the olden days, 10 years ago when I was in automotive, come with the hammer and just tell the supplier we need a price reduction, deliver. No, it has completely changed. Now it's really a matter of the customer of choice going into that dialogue, being that partner they wish they had, and them wanting to collaborate with you. Because at the end of the day, if you have a good relationship with your supplier, you will be the one benefiting in the future. And if there is another crisis, if they have a limited amount of stock, who do you think they'll be giving their supplies to? The one who's always come with the hammer, or the one who has actually been there, supported them, listened, had a relationship? And when they were in need with payment terms, or when they came up with an innovation, actually listening to them and making them feel important, making them feel listened to. I think this is really a big wake-up call for all of us, for many buyers, that the way we've done it in the past, it definitely changed in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ramit, I want to come to you and ask a similar question, and then I'm going to check in with Phil and see what's coming up in the Q&A chat with the audience. Would you say that your personal and your team and your company's notion of what is required to be a customer of choice has changed or evolved in any way based on the experience of the last year and a half?
I would say, first of all, I really agree with what Charlotte said. And, for us, I think we were always in Henkel, we were always making sure that we are a customer of choice. But this pandemic really brought up the importance of that topic. So we were making sure that the suppliers that really need the money to survive were getting that money to survive, because there were many of these, much smaller suppliers who the working capital really, the importance of working capital really came up during this pandemic. So we made sure that wherever we needed to have these suppliers sustain themselves, we made sure of that. We made sure that we were recognizing them at every point, because each of them we could see were really going way beyond their mandate. So they were actually, if it was material suppliers, they were finding all sorts of novel ways to get the material to our factories. If it was, let's say, logistics suppliers, they were making sure that they were opening their warehouses or giving us trucks, even though, let's say in many places the truck drivers were kind of gone missing, but the suppliers were working really day and night to make sure that we were getting all of these facilities just to kind of have our operations running. So I think the importance of being a customer of choice was really highlighted during this pandemic, like never before. Yeah.
Excellent. So Phil, let me check in with you briefly and get sort of a read on where our audience is. Have any questions or comments come in that we should incorporate in this part of the discussion?
Yeah, I do have one question, and I also just want to encourage, first of all, thank you, Kelly, for coming to me. I do want to encourage everybody to pop questions in the chat or in the Q&A because I am keeping a watch on them. But I do have one question, and I'm going to pose it to Ramit first, and then Charlotte can answer as well. And both of you spoke there about customer of choice becoming more important, which is music to my ears because it's something that I'm a really big advocate of. I think that it's an imperative for procurement. But the question that we have is, is this a systemic change for procurement? That customer of choice is now accepted by our organizations as something we should be focusing on post-pandemic, or do you feel it was more in response to short-term needs through the pandemic, and that perhaps it goes back to business as usual when we go back to whatever, not necessarily normal, but some consistency is? And Ramit, I'll ask that to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I think that's a great question. So what I would say is that, depending on the companies, especially in Henkel or many other organizations that I know of, I think this is something that's here to stay. I don't think that this is a passing fad. In fact, any company that has a long-term vision. So in Henkel, in fact, we actually talk about being for the good of generations. So any company that has a long-term vision will make sure that the supplier network is sustainable. It's not something that we can just take for granted and have move from one supplier to the other just on the basis of price. This is something that we've never had even in the past, but I think now it's paramount that we will be making sure that the supplier network is a sturdy one, is resilient one, and of course is very agile. Yeah.
Definitely encouraging to hear, because there's a danger of us kind of being responsive in the moment. And what we often see in procurement and supply chain is kind of this cyclical nature of where we think about customer of choice, and then we go back to, well, we need to save money, and the priorities change. So keeping it front and center is going to be so important. Charlotte, are you seeing the same?
Absolutely. In terms of the systemic change, it will also be, I think it will really penetrate throughout organizations, different parts of the organization. It will actually, I think in the future, it will become part of a new strategic framework, similar to what we have now, what we call the employee experience. We will have the customer experience. And I wonder whether in the future, because now it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's the first time we're talking about it, but it is something new that we are looking at the whole this whole change separately. And I wonder who will actually own it in the future, and what the future will behold, and whether in organizations they will be maybe this will be a new role within the organization, so having a lead for supplier experience, or making sure that that being that customer of choice is a new variable within the company, something that we want to strive, and becoming that new measurement. Who knows? But I think it is definitely a change, and that's here to stay.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. Excellent. Thank you, Kelly. I'll keep an eye. We've got a couple more questions that I'll come to later on as you come back to me. So, and for everybody, please keep them coming.
Excellent. Thank you. And actually, Charlotte, that's an interesting point for transition. You bring up this idea of who is going to own it, this notion of different types of experiences all being formalized and built up within organizations at the same time. If we're going to be good procurement supply chain professionals, our practice tells us we should benchmark. If we want to improve, we should try to understand where we are today. And one of the interesting numbers that came out of the HICS survey that's available in that report is the response that 78% of the enterprises that participated responded that their suppliers would rate them as either excellent or best in class to do business with. And yet, when we drill down into the specifics, there are known issues around communication, there are known issues around on-time payment, and there are, in many cases, multiple systems that each supplier has to log into in order to do business with one customer. Do you think that most organizations today have an objective picture about what it is really like to do business with them? Ramit, let me start with you. How do you get a sense of what it is really like in reality to do business with your team and organization versus how you might rate yourselves from the inside?
So in our case, we have actually been doing surveys with our suppliers. We have positions such as supplier quality managers. We of course have an entire procurement function, and we are auditing all of these fairly regularly. So what we are making sure of is that we know, we at least have a good enough pulse of how our suppliers look at us.
Mm-hmm.
So of course we do this on the customer side, but we also do this on a supplier side. So we make sure that the suppliers that we would like to work with equally like to work with us. So it just cannot be a one-way street, for us. So we put a lot of effort. So we have clear metrics that talk about payments on time to suppliers.
Okay.
That talk about if the supplier is raising the issue, then how quickly that is getting resolved. If we are, of course, raising issues to our suppliers, how quickly are those getting resolved? So we have very clear metrics and pretty clear review mechanisms to get a good sense of, how in sync we are with how our suppliers view us.
Excellent. And to your earlier point about working capital, understanding that on your suppliers during the course of the pandemic, obviously step number one towards having happy suppliers is, pay them on time. So that's an absolutely critical thing to track. Charlotte, from your perspective, how do you access and track and capture the voice of the supplier in terms of that experience?
It's a big and firstly a big and great question. We do track their surveys. Depends on the organization, but in our case, there are e-marketplaces. So that's when certain data statistics can be tracked either through a survey to the supplier, but one needs to consider whether it's 100% true, whether this is really what you can use, just because the supplier, if you do a survey, they are mostly inclined to say everything is great, just because they don't want to tell the customer necessarily that they are unsatisfied with the system. So I wouldn't completely base my answer just on the surveys, but to your point, I think it's an organization's ambition to become to offer the supplier a best-in-class experience, and there is still a gap. There is still a way to go to have that best-in-class experience. Currently, we are using multiple systems for a supplier to get onboarded. I remember in my olden days, it takes days and weeks, maybe months, for the supplier to be actually registered. And I think right now it depends on the organization. It depends on also with the country. I've worked in Asia, in Europe, and in the US, and I have seen differences in different cultures, different industries. But altogether, there is still a gap. We want to be best in class, but it's still for the supplier. It's still a mission to have that easy process to be a supplier. So I think if we start by streamlining, by making it more personal, maybe if it's a small spend, having a more easier process for the supplier to register themselves. If it's a bigger spend, have it more complex, but in a way, customizing, making it a lot more streamlined, easier for the customer to register, and just reducing the number of different systems. I think this would be a great start to help with that customer experience, especially now that since post-COVID, we are actually really talking about it, discussing it, and it's going to be more and more important. How are we going to improve and really build that relationship with our supplier? So I think it has been a bit of a wake-up call for many, and many have already worked on it, but also for other companies that I worked for, they have not in the past. And I think this is the great opportunity to now think, okay, where are we? Have the surveys, but at the same time, what can we do to improve? So surveys are good to start with, but I would argue that they are not necessarily 100% what I would just base all of my research on.
Absolutely.
I would go into interviews, I would do a bit more deep digging to really understand the pain points.
Yeah, because it really is an invested supplier. You know, we've all been through the polite greeting, right? How are you? Fine. You know, there's nothing worse than when you say, how are you? And you find out, right? Because that's 15 minutes. But in the case of our suppliers, we're asking them, how are you? We need that information back, right? And so putting them in a position where they are both willing and incentivized to share that information with us can be huge. So if I stay with you for a minute, Charlotte, we've talked a little bit about some of the ways in which we might find out what the supplier experience is currently like so that we can address pain points and improve it. When you think about making those improvements and what the corresponding benefit might be in terms of procurement's ability to perform to expectations, how do you see that connection between creating a good supplier experience on the one hand and having a strategic or high value or high performing procurement function on the other hand?
Well, I would definitely start with communication. You know, we've now all transitioned into this e-marketplace, into e-procurement, making autonomous procurement using AI. You know, making it a lot more just losing that actual human touch of the supplier and just putting in a ticket and then who knows where that ticket will end up with. But I think, I'm a big believer in the future of that. I do believe that this is the future. We're going towards autonomous procurement. We're going to a way to streamline a lot of procurement, getting less RFPs in the future, pre-negotiated base. But ultimately, we don't want to lose that connection with the supplier because we need something from them, and they need something from us. So I think in the future, if one of the main points will be retaining communication, also picking up the phone, making sure that they are heard. You don't lose complete track of that human being a human and this human interaction. So a lot can be autonomized, but we mustn't lose that human experience. And for example, in the past, in one of my projects, which I worked on, where I implemented a sustainable procurement program, and we wanted to approach a few suppliers where we wanted them to fill out a long survey. So instead of me just sending out an email or them getting reminders, they actually picked up the phone and had that conversation with them, and they were so thrilled and happy and surprised in a good way that they then immediately felt important, and they filled out that whole survey. So I think just picking up the phone and for them having someone, I think this will improve the supplier experience a lot. And then also with what I mentioned before in terms of that whole technology aspect, looking internally with your leadership and understanding how can we streamline that experience, and maybe understanding what are my supplier buckets. And if you have a supplier where you have a purchase order for, I don't know, $50 a year, do they really need to fill out and go through that whole process than having another supplier with millions of spend? So I think really understanding these differences in your supply base, but overall, so communication and technology, I think these are the two main points I would say to enhance your supplier experience.
Yeah, and that's actually an excellent point to bring up. You know, we talk about supplier experience in the singular, right? But in one way, you're talking about the supplier tiers or supplier segmentation. There are multiple different supplier groups that we're working with. We want to make sure each of them has a good supplier experience, but it may not be exactly the same experience that they're having in working with us. And certainly balancing that automation with the human side of the relationship, that is a tricky one, especially at scale for procurement to manage. Absolutely.
That shouldn't be an excuse. I think
agreed.
people can make time, and if it's just a couple of minutes a day, just this one phone call, it would mean so much for that supplier. And for some suppliers, it may mean everything, that they are so valued and so important, and that really will improve that relationship, and that will also help with being the customer of choice at the end.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, Ramit, you actually mentioned several specific KPIs that Henkel tracks when it comes to measuring or understanding better the supplier experience. Have you looked internally to see how some of those KPIs or potentially improvement in those KPIs can actually deliver a corresponding performance boost to procurement itself?
Absolutely. In fact, let me give you two specific examples of such KPIs. So I'll start with sustainability. So we just concluded very recently, just last month, a competition on sustainability. So we had given fairly clear guidelines to our suppliers on which parameters we would be measuring them and so on. And just last month, we had we concluded the competition. We had the supplier sustainability awards. So kind of making sure that the focus of the suppliers remains on this critical parameter. The other one I'll talk about is, let's say, safety. So we have a campaign for our logistics transporters, which is called Go Safe campaign. So what we do is we give them trainings, we give them, let's say, collateral materials. We make sure that we are going and auditing them on these safety parameters. So to Charlotte's point, I think we are ensuring a connect with them beyond just, let's say, beyond the regular pricing discussions or beyond just the dry discussion. So we're making sure that if we are looking at metrics, we are humanizing them, we are discussing them, we are actually measuring them, we are going that extra mile to make sure that the suppliers know that we are serious about these metrics. So yeah, so these are a couple of examples. Of course, there are many others, but I think these are quite relevant to the discussion.
Well, in particular, I think one of the interesting things that comes to light about what you're saying, generally speaking, today we've sort of lumped procurement and supply chain. But what you're really talking about, especially in the area of logistics, is recognizing that you can't hit your safety targets if your suppliers are not hitting those targets, right? And so as a company, you're working through the supply chain, but it's not about penalizing the companies that fall short. It's about incentivizing through creative programs like the awards, through supportive programs like making sure that they have the materials or the literature that they need to understand those metrics. How do you manage the responsibility for that type of work within your team? Is the responsibility for coming up with ideas like the awards or providing the documentation something that is associated with the category of spend and the supplier relationships? Or do you have a specific team of people that actually focus on, okay, what are we looking to drive through our supply chain? And regardless of who they are and what they provide to us, how do we need to support them?
It's a mix of both, Kelly. So we do have specifically people. So for example, the Go Safe campaign has been designed by the manager whose designation is dangerous goods manager. So
okay.
So we have these people who are making sure that we're getting our goods from point A to point B in a safe manner, no loss to the human life, also environmentally safe. So these are the people who are then also tasked with engaging the suppliers to make sure that those suppliers are equally, let's say, aware about the importance of not just the human aspect, but also the environmental aspect when it comes to safety, for example. So it definitely, and on the other hand, the sustainability awards was actually something that we were brainstorming within the teams on how do we engage suppliers, and it came out as an idea. It was a bottoms-up idea, and then the team that came up with the idea was the team that actually led it right to the execution. So it like I said, it was a mix of the two, and it worked very well in both these cases.
Excellent. And it's sort of back to this same idea of if there are multiple things that you're trying to achieve with different groups of suppliers, you're going to have to employ different kinds of tactics to ultimately get to your objective. Now, on that point of supplier segmentation or establishing tiers, right, who's strategic, who's sort of in the mass middle, and who are maybe some of the more transactional or limited scope suppliers that, as Charlotte, you mentioned, we want to really make it simple for them to get through the process. Ramit, how do you decide which of those suppliers are truly going to have the very personal, very human kind of managed relationship, which will have some blend of human contact and systems management, and which of the suppliers are predominantly going to have a technology-driven, although hopefully still good and personal, supplier experience in working with your company?
So yes, we do have a fairly structured segmentation program, and so we do, and I think you kind of answered the question because when we have these a segment of suppliers where our strategic category managers, the category managers are actually making sure that we have a touch point with these suppliers on a fairly regular basis. But then there's also a very long tail of suppliers with whom we cannot all get in touch with.
Right.
But we do have a fairly good interface in terms of technology, a supplier portal, the websites for them, the mailers and everything, so that they are not feeling left out. But of course, we have both these categories. So it's a fairly clear segmentation, and it's not a linear segmentation. We generally have a matrix-based segmentation. But the end result, of course, is where we are making sure that these are the most strategic ones, while these are the ones where I think technology could suffice. So yes.
Absolutely, because there are so many supplier relationships to be managed and so much information. Charlotte, you've talked a lot about communication. Does that come into play? Do decisions about communication method factor into the way you and your team segment suppliers once you've kind of put them into those tiers or buckets, I think, as you said it earlier? How do you make those decisions about where a supplier should fall and what type of communication is going to be the most appropriate?
Well, I think we shouldn't really, when I class the suppliers, I only class them in terms of the onboarding process. But afterwards, I would never class the supplier in terms of different communication. Every supplier, everyone is so crucially important, and that's why I would make sure that everyone's voice is heard. And when there is a request in the system, that it's just important that if there is a ticket coming in, it's just not an automated, just a computer note that they receive, but there's actually human behind it, Yeah. So what we've done is actually started, depending on of course the topic, but if it's some programs or some communication you would like to get across, is actually host a webinar. Nowadays, it's so easy to have virtual meetings, and instead of just sending this mass email, but actually having a supplier webinar and inviting them all, making sure that they get to ask their questions, they see the people, they see the team, having that interaction. When I managed a big RFP once, and it was already a couple of years ago, but we had 77 suppliers, and instead of me just sending out an email and asking them for their offer, I actually hosted a webinar. I said I had a supplier day, I called it virtual day, and you can imagine before COVID it was something special. Now it's normal, but that's what I think is the future, is having if you have a supplier procurement supplier sustainability program, host these webinars, have that interaction, explain your scope, explain what it is that you're envisioning, how can they help you, how can they build teams together, and really going into this dialogue into the supplier innovation. So I think altogether, yes, we are driving into autonomous procurement. Everything will be automized, but ultimately that relationship, now is the time more than ever that we have the technology to be able to go to have that interaction with our suppliers.
Yes.
And I think now's the time that we can really start having regular webinars, invite our suppliers, have them join either or not anonymous, or that they can see each other, depends on your company culture and regulation, but really be able to close that gap and build that relationship, build that trust. It's more crucial than ever before, and now is the time that we have all of the capabilities to be able to do it. So there is no excuse going forward.
Now, one of the things that I really like that you shared is that you think about supplier segmentation one way in terms of onboarding and another way in terms of sort of the ongoing management during the life of the whole contract, right? And I think what's so important about that is that, you know, I remember being in these shoes and there would be some new process or policy or framework that was going to be rolled out. You say, okay, this framework makes sense, this process makes sense. Now all I have to do is roll it out to 23,000 suppliers, and your eyes sort of glaze over and you think, maybe tomorrow, right? That's just not, this is not a realistic thing. Whereas if you try to segment and improve, starting with the supplier onboarding process, it's kind of more staggered. It's one set of contracts or one set of suppliers or one category of spend at a time. And that makes it sound so much more actionable. Is that something that you've rolled out formally? We're saying we're not just going to look at supplier onboarding as one bullet point or one step in the project plan. We're going to think of supplier onboarding as a formal and focused activity. Or is that something that you think has just sort of naturally resulted from the way you approach working with people generally and suppliers more specifically?
Oh no, I think it has truly become part of the strategic framework. We have had a change that we've done. We've had global procurement teams around the world, and then suddenly we've gone through this whole phase of having procurement hubs where you have strategic procurement in the different sites, but then you may have a couple of dedicated really procurement centers who create the PO, who do the actual the process, the system work. And I think in that whole change, already going from changing the procurement function from every buyer having to also do purchase orders, I think that shift has taken place. And with that shift, this whole strategic framework has changed, and it has become part of the process. How do we have a smooth onboarding? But going a step further, how can we make it more customized? How can we improve that onboarding relationship, with that experience with our supplier? And I think that really, I think what can help is the supplier knowing that when they try to onboard, that it doesn't just go into the system, but they are actually that the queries are really being routed and handled by individuals, and that they're actually humans responding to them. So back to your question, I think we've already gone through a big change in procurement. The function of procurement has changed over the last decade, and just going. Being able to have more marketplaces, that will change the supplier experience. It will be part of the strategic framework.
Right. And my hope would be that procurement continues to own and invest in the supplier experience, but this is not solely a procurement or supply chain responsibility. And although that's where we've focused, I think what I want to do is ask each of you a question, maybe a little bit more expansively, and then Phil, I'll check in and I'll see what's going on in the chat with the audience. Ramit, when you think about all of the other functions or roles in the organization that end up either deliberately or incidentally playing a role in the supplier experience, you know, procurement and supply chain are not their only point of contact, even if it's systems, even if it's how requests come in. How do you think about those other touch points in your organization outside of procurement and supply chain that end up being part of the supplier experience, and how we can make sure that they are included and folded in any of the improvements or changes that we try to lead?
Yeah, absolutely. And Kelly, I think that's a great question. And I think we have many instances at least that I have seen within the organization where several functions have come together to make sure that either a particular problem was resolved, or I'm talking about a supplier related, or let's say the supplier overall experience is to be enhanced. So if there is, let's say, a new project that needs that's a supplier focused project, we would never have only the procurement or only the supply chain function involved. We would pretty much have the SBU heads, we would have the finance guys. In one case, we even had our HR head because the supplier had some manpower troubles, and we wanted to make sure that we are helping the suppliers with not just not just transactionally, but with their HR or with the people related problems. So even our HR pitched in. So pretty much a cross-functional exercise, definitely not just focused only on the procurement or supply chain functions. So this is something that I think is pretty much ingrained. Of course, there are many transactional activities which are best done by an expert who is, let's say, within procurement or something. But then if it is something strategic, we have forums where a cross-functional team gets together, a fairly senior cross-functional team gets together to address those supplier-related topics.
Excellent. And Charlotte, same question to you. I mean, you mentioned earlier that you see the future as having more procurement information and activity decentralized. I think a lot of people feel that same way. How do you see other roles, other functions getting involved in the supplier experience management process, in creating it, in improving it, and in defining it?
Well, I agree with Ramit that it's really a cross-functional element, and I would see that so where this will sit ultimately, maybe in the I would say maybe in the center of excellence, so that they would be because they are the ones, they do collaborate with many different stakeholders, but at the end this could be maybe a good starting point, having a collaboration with even HR to have lessons learned, best practices, how HR have established the great employee experience, and maybe learning some patterns, some lessons learned, how they approached it, and then how we can approach delivering that whole supplier experience. But I mean, ultimately, where it will sit, or who will lead it or do it, or what role will come out of it, that is really still in the future. But right now, it's kind of bringing together all different stakeholders, having lessons learned, and someone taking the lead and starting. It's a good question where it will sit in the future. I don't know the answer right now. I would just say maybe center of excellence.
And keeping an open mind, right? As it changes, right, the roles will shift. Phil, let me check in with you and see what's going on in the chat. Are there any comments or questions from the audience that you want to jump in and field with Ramit and Charlotte?
Yeah, there's probably one question, just because of from a time perspective. We actually had Anusha was asking about sustainability, so I was really happy to hear Ramit was talking about sustainability and sustainability awards, because Anusha was asking in the context of top practices for sustainability. The question that I want to pose is, we had a question from Vivek, and this may be a challenge that both Charlotte and Ramit have had in trying to overcome perhaps some folks within the organization who didn't necessarily see that supplier experience management is something they should focus on. And so I'm going to pose first to Ramit and then to Charlotte. Vivek asked, how can we implement new kind of supply chain management, supplier experience management policies where management may only be looking for a traditional approach and traditional working methods? So really thinking about this as some tips, like how do we overcome folks who do not necessarily believe in all the things that we've talked about today?
All right, so this is a typical change management exercise, and I would say change definitely begins at the top. So once the senior management has their focus, and once the let's say the purpose is clear, that we want to go for a comprehensive supplier experience rather than just making a transactional, let's say, just making it a transaction focused experience. I think that's where it starts. So the buy-in from the top management, or I would say just the initiative from the top management, will then get you the buy-in from the rest of the organization. I think that's the first step. And then I would say there need to be concrete actions. So for example, some examples that I took already, these awards, the trainings, so there need to be some concrete actions in the direction that we want the organization to move in. And of course, we need the entire organization to get a buy-in of that. It should not just be a procurement driven initiative or something. And that's the example that I was talking about. So for example, the sustainability awards, this came from a cross-functional team, and that team was then tasked with making this happen. And that actually made sure that the entire organization was getting involved there. So yeah, I think these are some of the tips that I would say would definitely help us.
Thanks, Ramit. And anything to add to that, Charlotte, from your experience?
Yeah, from my experience, I have worked in an organization which was very, very much traditional and had that whole hammer approach to suppliers. So and definitely not offering that supplier experience, and trying to convince that sort of leadership to specialize on supplier experience. I would recommend, if you are in a situation like that, try yourself with your supplier base, start to host certain webinars to build that supplier experience, and then you can present to your leadership what you've done and all of the good outcome it has generated, maybe additional savings, maybe how you've secured other stock or helped other teams by building these great relationships. But I think showing them, and that's how you can also build internal trust with your leadership, and having a best case that it is actually really easy. They don't need to invest into a lot of resources, into a lot of big budgets, but having already that supplier experience by offering certain webinars to explain the vision, the mission, the direction that the company would like to go. I think this can be a great start.
No, I love that. I'm sorry, Charlotte, I didn't mean to jump over you. I was going to say, I just love the idea of, you kind of build a proof of concept or a pilot within your own supply base, and then use that as a starting point to demonstrate the ROI.
Exactly. There is no. There's always a reasoning why they say no, and maybe they're just not educated, or maybe they're not fully aware. So I think by showing a best practice, and you can trigger a great conversation within your leadership.
All right, thank you very much, Charlotte. Back to you, Kelly.
Sure, and actually it's funny, as I'm checking on time, we're coming up to the top of the hour. I actually said to Charlotte and Ramit exactly 1 hour ago that I would snap my fingers and we would be in the moment that we're in now, like time travel. So it has been yet another very fast AOP Live hour. Before I thank our guests and let them share their contact information, I want to both remind everybody, please join us again next Thursday as we move on and actually look into the process for formally putting supplier experience management programs in place. Please also download that report. Again, the link is in the chat. But as we let you both go, I will finish the hour on the easiest question of all. Charlotte, if folks would like to reach out and get in touch with you and add you to their network, what is the best way for them to find you?
Definitely LinkedIn, or if you would like my email, it's also on my website, but I'm definitely very approachable.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Ramit, how about you?
Very similar. So I am definitely active on LinkedIn. So, and I actually actively try to participate in discussions. I encourage, in case anybody has questions for me, I'm very much available on LinkedIn. You can easily find me, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions to the best of my knowledge.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for your time, for your energy, and for fielding all of these questions about supplier experience. And thank you as well to everybody that has joined us for today's session. I appreciate you giving us your time. We hope to see you again next week, and have a terrific rest of your day. Thank you.